Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 28 of our verse-by-verse study of Genesis. Let's begin with a prayer and invite the Lord to join us in this session this morning. Thank you, Abba, for the privilege that you've given us to study your word and to learn more about you and about your plan for our lives. We ask your Spirit open our minds and our hearts this morning as we study your word, that these things might become a source of blessing and challenge. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. In this session, we're going to go back over some material that was covered last time and expand on some of the details. Our focus is going to be on the marriage of Jacob to Leah and Rachel to get a clearer picture of just how and why the events occurred as they did. That requires a deeper look into some traditions and practices of the time and the culture of those involved. The traditional wedding. This process has been discussed in a bit more detail in an earlier study on the Feast of the Lord. Modern wedding traditions in both Jewish and Arab cultures today differ from what was used in the times of the patriarchs up through the time of Christ. Some of these ancient elements and observances may remain, but the wedding itself generally resembles one we would be familiar with. One example is that, with the possible exception of some ultra-Orthodox groups, marriages are not arranged without the couple's consent. Often there is a marriage contract between the two families, but with the bride and groom's participation. The traditional Near Eastern marriage process observed in Israel during the times of Christ was generally as follows. Number one, the marriage contract between the two families spelling out the rights of the bride is signed. Once the contract is signed and gifts exchanged, the couple is considered legally married, but they do not immediately consummate the marriage. Two, then we have a betrothal period where the groom goes away to his father's house to prepare a place for his bride. Once the father of the groom determines the arrangements to receive the bride are complete, he sends his son to retrieve his bride. This could be days or weeks or even a year or more. Three, the groom goes to retrieve his bride, usually accompanied by wedding guests, brings her back to his father's house, enters the prepared bridal suite, and they consummate the marriage. Number four, and the wedding feast proceeds and will be joined later by the couple. The process outlined in Genesis chapter 29 is older and a bit different, though resembling what was outlined above. In chapter 29, we see a process that looks more like this. Number one, Jacob approaches Rachel's father, Laban, and negotiates to marry her. A bride price is agreed upon, and that was 7 years of service to Laban, and permission to marry is granted. The marriage contract seen here is verbal, not written. Number two, 7 years later, after fulfilling his part of the contract, Jacob approaches Laban for him to fulfill his part of the agreement and set the wedding. Laban agrees. Number three, there is a wedding party. And unlike the later version of the wedding feast that included women, this party included only men. And that's significant to the events that follow. And number four, at sunset, Laban presents Jacob with his bride, and they consummate the marriage. Number five, the next morning, Jacob discovers that he's been tricked, and he spent the night with Rachel's sister, Leah, not Rachel. And number six, after confronting Laban, he is informed that it was not the practice in his culture for the younger daughter, Rachel, to marry before the elder daughter, Leah. He proposes a compromise and offers Rachel for another 7 years of service. In a consolation, As a consolation, he graciously offered to let him marry Rachel now rather than after the agreed 7 years. But he had to conclude Leah's week, that is the honeymoon, before doing so. And number 7, Jacob finishes Leah's week and immediately marries Rachel and then spends a marriage week with her. Number 8, Jacob has 2 brides and owes another 7 years of service to his trickster father-in-law to pay for the second one. In trying to understand some of what happened, we have questions, not the least of which is how in the world did Jacob not know he was betting someone other than Rachel? We will get into that shortly. Meanwhile, we have a few subjects to clarify. Now, what follows is some information I discovered online at a website called thetorah.com. It is a Jewish website, not Christian-oriented. So the things you see there are going to be seen from a Jewish perspective. And you might find some interesting stuff there if you want to visit. So I'm citing this site as a basic source of the references of basic source of some of the materials you're going to see. All right. To marry a woman, a man had to first pay her father a mohar, a bride price. The price can vary depending on time, place, or social status. Certain circumstances can demand a larger payment than normal. For instance, after Shechem debases Jacob's daughter Dinah, that comes later, eager to get Jacob and his sons to allow him to marry the girl, he offers a higher bride price that would be expected for someone in Dinah's situation. This is being suggested because he placed himself at a disadvantage by taking the girl without permission and before they were married. In another example, Saul demands an unusual bride price of the foreskins of 100 Philistines from David to marry his daughter. His objective was to get David killed in the process of collecting the bride price. But David succeeds and does marry Michal. He later referred back to this as his betrothal payment. Then we have the marriage contract. In addition to the bride price, ancient Near Eastern documents also mention a marriage contract. Contracts were not always written documents. Most times they were oral agreements, such as we've seen between Jacob and Laban. The terms of these very early marriage contracts include the dowry from the father to the bride and the marriage gifts from the husband to the bride's family. This later parallels the biblical mohar and was generally composed of movable objects such as household items, furniture, clothing, textiles, silver, jewelry, handmaids, animals, and sometimes even land. Later, Judaism developed its own version of the marriage contract called the ketubah, which focused on the husband's financial obligations to the wife. The ketubah primarily spelled out the rights of the bride in the marriage. Then we have the betrothal period. When the girl's father agreed to a union between the suitor and his daughter, the suitor often did not have the bride price handy. This may be one reason for the betrothal period, or what the rabbis call the Erushin. The girl's betrothal to the man made her unavailable to other men, but she still lived with her father until the man paid the bride price. Another reason for the betrothal period is that the marriage agreement was often concluded when the girl was still a minor, that is, in pre-puberty, which was considered to be too early for marriage in even ancient Near Eastern cultures. The deal would be concluded and the girl betrothed, but she would not enter the husband's house and the marriage bed until she reached an appropriate age. Thus, the time between betrothal and the consummation of the marriage could be quite long, Some old Babylonian contracts include a 5 to 10 year betrothal. What about Jacob's deal with Laban? This may help us understand Jacob's deal with Laban. He wishes to marry Rachel, but he has no land or money to speak of. He is a guest in Laban's house. Marriage is not free, so he offers his own labor for 7 years as the bride price. While the text makes no mention of his being betrothed first, Jacob's need to wait until the bride price is paid in full in order to marry Rachel fits with the biblical and ancient Near Eastern practice. Jacob serves his 7 years and asks Laban to fulfill his part of the contract and produce the paid in full bride and the wedding. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel and believed he had negotiated and paid the bride price for her. But on the wedding night, Laban gave him Leah instead. Jacob does not detect the switch until the next morning when he discovers he is married to the wrong daughter. We'll get into that later. If we look at Laban's agreement carefully, we can see that he never explicitly accepts Jacob's proposal or mentions which of his daughters he is offering. And Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man." That word "give," her, who is her? Jacob thought her was Rachel, but Laban cleverly avoided mentioning names. Once the switch was discovered, Laban claims that Jacob should have known that in Haran, one does not marry off a younger daughter before the older. Laban was probably implying with that statement that surely you must have understood that to marry Rachel, you had to marry Leah first. And since Jacob took Leah and slept with her, there was no turning back. All right, now we have a second marriage, but it's in reverse order. Laban does not stop here, but offers Jacob a way forward. Genesis 29:27 says, "Fulfill her week, and will give you this one also for the service which you will serve me still another 7 years." So Laban's intention all along was to trap Jacob into working for him for 14 years, and at the same time marry off both his daughters, including the less attractive one, for whom Laban would not have otherwise gotten such a large bride price as he received for Rachel. Nevertheless, Laban understands that he can only push Jacob so far without causing an out-and-out breach, so it suggests something unusual. Jacob will marry Rachel almost immediately, but pay the bride price afterwards. And Jacob agrees to this compromise. Genesis 29:28. Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Then Jacob also went in to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. Normally, the bride price is paid up front or over a period of time. Only upon payment in full does the marriage take place. But here we have Jacob getting Rachel immediately after fulfilling Leah's week and before the payment of any bride price for her. This reverses the process, but it's not unheard of in wedding practices of the period. About a marriage paid in full. Sometimes the payment period extends even beyond the wedding, and the final payment takes place after consummation of the wedding, of the marriage. The husband supplies money, and the father supplies the sexual rights to his daughter. But the birth of a child, since it is one of the main reasons for marriage, can also be seen as the culmination or the final stage of marriage. In many ancient Near Eastern marriage contracts, it stimulates that the husband has until the birth of the first child to make his final payment. All right, about Rachel's barrenness and the bride price. Despite the couple living together in an intimate relationship, the biblical text assumes that women remain barren until God activates the womb. Thus, whether or not a woman gets pregnant is dependent on God's intervention. Genesis 29:31 tells us that God opened Leah's womb, but this does not explain Rachel's barrenness. So why does God intervene early on the behalf of Leah, but not Rachel? Leah, who was married with the bride price paid up front, has a child every year, 6 boys and a girl. While Rachel does not have a child until year 7 of her marriage. While Rachel requests a son in year 4 of her marriage, God will not grant her one for 3 more years. That is, at the moment of her bride price is paid in full. In this reading, the story of Rachel's barrenness underscores the incomplete nature of their union until Jacob has paid his debt to Laban in full. The birth of Joseph occurs around the same time that the bride price is paid in full, and then Jacob asked to leave and return to his family. Genesis 30:25, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service, which I have done for you." All right. About Rachel's infertility. Rachel was barren according to Genesis 29:31. Aside from her beauty, this is just about the only characterization that Genesis offers of Rachel. Her first words addressed to Jacob are, "Give me children or I shall die." The focus on Rachel's infertility to the exclusion of nearly every other aspect of her identity means that infertility is effectively her identity. For more than most societies, Rachel lived in a world that was practically designed to make infertile women feel outcast and alone. As has been seen in, as has ever been the case, the constant confrontation of the infertile mother with the fertility of her neighbors was a source of pain. In the Bible, this pain is highlighted by the cultural and literary custom of polygamy in why? The husband having more than one wife. As such as Sarah and Rachel lived face to face with the living embodiment of their anguish. In naming her son Joseph, Rachel makes it clear that what infertility feels like. God has taken away my reproach. Reproach or disgrace in some translations is the Hebrew word harpa, and it means shame, reproach, or scorn, and is used of uncircumcised men, men with eyes gouged out, cowardness, rape victims, and even the collapsed wall of Jerusalem. The experience of infertility in ancient Israel was utterly crushing. There can be no disgrace, no harpa, without other people before whom one feels that shame, without other people to do the shaming. Such shaming is often based on the notion that infertility was divine punishment. And there is no biblical evidence that Rachel was to blame for her infertility. Tellingly, when she confronts her infertility, she neither prays nor repents of any sin, nor confesses any iniquity, nor asks forgiveness of any kind. She doesn't turn to God at all. The text does not note any display of virtue, piety, penance, or self-examination leading to a divinely wrought cure, and yet God does make her fertile. When Rachel becomes pregnant with Joseph, Genesis 30:22 notes that God opened her womb. God's role in conception is depicted as opening the womb. Then it would seem that prior to this moment, the womb was, by default, closed. The best proof of this concept of fertility is not the opening of Rachel's womb, since we know that she was previously infertile. It is rather that the same is said about Leah, Rachel's fertile counterpart. Before bearing her first child, Reuben, Yahweh opened her womb. If neither Rachel nor Leah can become pregnant without divine intervention, then it seems possible to argue that from the biblical perspective, all women are by nature created infertile. That all women are by nature infertile, according to the Bible, is borne out by the ostensibly common term open, a term that appears rather generic, but which, when God is the subject, is both rare and meaningful. In Psalm 105:41, Yahweh opened a rock so that water gushed forth, an unusual moment for a rock if there ever was one. And then Yahweh opens Isaiah's ears in Isaiah 54-5, not thereby changing him from deaf to hearing, but transforming this ordinary human ability to hear into the extraordinary prophetic ability to hear Yahweh's words. Yahweh opens Ezekiel's mouth in Ezekiel 3:27 and also 33:22, not thereby changing him from mute to speaking, but transforming his ordinary human ability to speak into the extraordinary prophetic ability to speak Yahweh's words. Yahweh opens the mouth of Balaam's donkey in Numbers 22:28, when Balaam was trying to force it to keep moving with blows. And of course, the snake of Genesis 3 notwithstanding, animals are not generally given to talking. In short, when God opens something, he changes it from the usual state to an unusual state. The womb is imagined as a closed chamber, one to which only God holds the key. For a child to be born, and perhaps even for the man's seed to enter, God must turn the key and unlock the door. It's not that Rachel is barren while Leah is not, but rather that both are barren to begin with, and Leah's womb is simply opened before Rachel's. If we say that active participation on the part of God is required for a woman to become fertile, then infertility is not divine punishment. It is rather a state in which all women enter the world. Direct, divine activity is required to open the womb, whether a woman has had children before or not, or whether she has even tried to become pregnant before or not. Every pregnancy, be it the first or the fifth, is ascribed to God's power. Sarah, who bears Isaac at 90 years old, said, "God has brought me laughter." Then when Leah, still in her relative youth, bears Issachar, her fifth son, she credits God. "God has given me my reward." For her sixth, Asher, she says, "God has given me a choice gift." In the ancient Israelite view, God is involved in every human conception. When we recognize that the default state of all women at all times is infertile, and that God needs to open the womb to allow conception to occur, the idea that infertility should be regularly understood as divine punishment can hardly be maintained. Infertility is not the result of divine punishment, but of divine inattention. We need to get God's attention explains another element common to the stories of these women. When Rachel's womb is finally open, it says that God remembered Rachel. When Sarah, a close synonym is said, paked, the Lord took note of Sarah. Infertility is not a divine decree. When all the pieces are put together, it's clear that from the perspective of these biblical authors, infertility is not a human shortcoming, but a divine one. The Hebrew Bible does not present infertility as a religious phenomenon, to be sure. It is, however, not the religious phenomenon commonly assumed. With only the most uncommon exceptions, God does not decree infertility. Those who have never borne children, who have never been able to conceive, have not been punished for any mysterious sin. They have done nothing wrong. It's not their actions that are at the root of their infertility. It is God's inaction. From the ancient past to our present, the ability to conceive has always been a source of anguish and confusion. A fundamental question of why me? The conclusion most often reached is a particularly painful and harsh one. The easy association of infertility as an impairment with divine displeasure is an ancient one, and its biblical roots can hardly be denied. But it is only an interpretation, one among many, and it is not necessarily the strongest. All right, the question that everybody has on their minds is, how is it that Jacob mistakes Leah for Rachel? We have previously seen that Jacob contracted to marry Rachel by paying the bride price of 7 years of service to Laban. At least he thought he was contracting to buy Rachel. Laban cleverly agreed to the deal, but never mentioned the name of the bride. At the end of 7 years of service, Jacob asked his future father-in-law to satisfy his end of the contracts at the wedding, which he did. On the night of the wedding, Jacob enters the bridal chamber and consummates the marriage, only to wake up the next morning to discover that Laban has switched the older daughter Leah for the younger daughter Rachel. The question in everybody's mind is, how is it possible that Jacob spent the night with Leah, all the while thinking she was Rachel? Now we will attempt to understand how that could have happened within the context of cultural traditions. One argument is Jacob couldn't see Leah. We begin by noting Genesis 29:23, where it says, "Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her." The word translated as evening can be translated as night or sunset. What is implied here is it was dark. Any illumination would be from oil lamps. I think we can also assume that Leah was veiled with her face covered. Though the text doesn't say so, such was the common way of dressing for women. Though the text uses darkness to explain the trick, this explanation seems insufficient. Wouldn't it be obvious to Jacob that the woman was not Rachel after some very brief conversation? When Jacob tricked Isaac into giving the blessings of the firstborn to him, he deceived his blind or nearly blind father with goatskins and the clothing that Esau wore. But despite these deceptions, Isaac was suspicious of Jacob when he said he was Esau. Jacob, in disguise, may have felt and smelled like Esau, but he didn't sound like Esau. His voice was different. And that's what Isaac noted. We would expect that even in the darkness, Jacob would recognize the voice of Leah as not that of Rachel. The text does not suggest that happened. Then we have the argument of extreme modesty, that there was no talking at all. Radak, who is the name that Rabbi David Kimchi uses, suggests that Jacob and Leah were entirely silent for considerations of modesty, but that seems out of keeping with Jacob kissing Rachel upon their first meeting. Even if they were entirely silent during intercourse, did they not talk before or after? How much conversation would it take to realize he is not with his beloved of 7 years? Isaac is suspicious after Jacob utters only a couple of sentences. There's no indication that Jacob was suspicious based on Leah's voice. Some argue Jacob was drunk. The Jewish Roman historian Josephus suggests that Jacob was drunk, mainly based on the fact that Jacob was coming from Laban's feast, and the Hebrew word for feast, mishta, can literally mean drinking party. Genesis 29:22 says, "So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast." The word that is translated as people is one that generally refers only to men. This apparently was an all-male booze party. No women present, especially not the bride. As the next verse tells us that, in the evening, Laban, took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. Jacob has no contact with his bride until after the party, after he has been drinking, and after sundown. Normally, there would have been a wedding feast with male and female guests with the bride present, but this all-male boozer was thrown by Laban instead. The whole purpose was probably to get Jacob drunk so he might not detect the bride switch. Though this interpretation is possible, it could be overreaching to suggest it was part of Laban's plot. However, knowing what we know about Laban, I think it's certainly plausible. Nor is it unreasonable to suggest that Jacob was intoxicated. Oh, what about Leah and Rachel? A rabbinic tradition holds that Rachel warns Jacob about the possibility of such a ruse. This is mainly very loosely based on the statement that Jacob makes to Rachel that he is her father's brother, implying he is a trickster like her father. But the statement more likely refers to their family relationship and not a character trait. This theory further proposes that Jacob gave Rachel certain signs or tokens, such as verbal clues or physical objects that she should reveal to him when she enters his tent, and thus he will know it's really her. The problem was that Rachel changed her mind. According to this theory, Rachel was complicit in tricking Jacob because of sisterly love. However, nothing in the biblical text itself suggests that Jacob ever considered he was being fooled or that he even discussed it with Rachel. Certainly nothing in the text implies that they set up a system of secret communications. All right, the theory that there was not much romance taking place here. We often read the story of Jacob's love for Rachel through the lens of modern romance. We imagine Jacob and Rachel forming a close bond, spending their 7 years of their engagement, speaking to each other about their future together, their interests, etc. This is because, from a modern vantage point, love and friendship are intertwined, and marriage is the bond contracted between equals based on mutual consent and attraction. But the Torah envisions a very different reality. Jacob is told by his parents that he must marry one of Laban's daughters, but he can choose which one. Immediately after Laban asks Jacob what his wages should be, and right before Jacob answers that he will work 7 years for Rachel, the text explains how Jacob made his choice. Genesis 29:16 says, now pay attention. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. The Hebrew word translated love here can be seen as extending from romantic love to infatuation or simply to lust. In this case, It's probably best to translate this as Jacob was smitten by Rachel. The point is that Jacob's love, infatuation for, or lust for Rachel is because of her beauty. And this is why he chose to marry her and not Leah. Jacob's further actions demonstrates that whereas he thought of Laban as a person with whom he needed to negotiate, he thought of Rachel only as the commodity he was acquiring. Jacob purchased the right to marry the beautiful Rachel from her father with 7 years' work. No mention is made of Jacob speaking to Rachel about it or Rachel being asked. Jacob does the work, happy to have found such a beautiful future wife, and after 7 years are up, Jacob comes to Laban ready to take Rachel to his tent. Verse Genesis 29:21, then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife now that I may go into her, for my time is complete. Note that Jacob says, give me my wife that I may go into her. This sounds rather sexually crude and lacking feelings of affections to me. He doesn't speak to Rachel about it or come to tell her that it's time to marry. As noted earlier, when Laban throws a feast in honor of the upcoming marriage, the bride isn't even there. It's a celebration between the two parties of the deal, Jacob and Laban. As Jacob views his marriage as a business transaction between him and Laban, when he sees Leah in the tent instead of Rachel the next morning, he does not confront Leah with the trick, or Rachel for that matter, but goes straight to Laban. In Jacob and Laban's business arrangement, Rachel and Leah are chattel. It was never up to them. That Rachel and Leah also see it this way is clear later when Jacob complains to them that he is afraid of their father and wishes to leave Haran. Both sisters respond. Genesis 31:14. When Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. It thus seems that the likely explanation for how the narrator imagines Jacob confusing Leah for Rachel so easily, even in the dark, is that unlike Isaac's familiarity with his two sons, Jacob didn't really know Rachel or Leah all that well. He was smitten with Rachel's beauty and wanted to marry her, but this does not mean that the two of them took long walks and chatted or anything akin to the behavior of a modern couple during courtship. It is likely that Jacob has not spoken to Rachel often or extensively during the 7 years, and this thus is not very familiar with her voice or the manner of her speaking. That Jacob did not speak much with Rachel before they married may also be the key to understanding Leah and Rachel's behavior. Why do Rachel and Leah go along with the bride switch? I suggest the following reading. After Jacob makes the deal with Laban and goes off to watch Laban's sheep for 7 years, Laban either tells his older daughter Leah that she is to marry Jacob or says nothing at all. Either way, when Leah is brought to Jacob that night, she believes that he wants to marry her. Rachel likely believed the same thing and would not have been hurt by Jacob asking for Leah's hand instead of hers, as she was the younger daughter, and cultural practice demanded the elder daughter marry first. Laban, of course, could not marry off Rachel without endangering his plan to bilk Jacob for 7 and hopefully 14 years of work. So Rachel remained single for those first 7 years until Laban pulls his trick, making it too late for Jacob to back out of the arrangement. That night, Jacob lies with his new wife, but they do not speak much. They barely know each other anyway. The next morning, he sees that she isn't the beautiful Rachel he remembers, but the less attractive older sister Leah, and he's angry. We do not hear how Leah feels about seeing her new husband's dismay, but learning that he does not really want her, but her younger sister. Nevertheless, from Leah's comments later in the narrative, we can imagine her reaction. Leah is the despised wife. She knows this and names 4 out of her 6 sons based on the hope that her providing Jacob with sons will make him love her. Leah is deeply pained by Jacob's rejection of her and his preference for her sister. This makes more sense when we realize that Leah believed that Jacob wanted to marry her originally. This also explains Leah's outburst to Rachel when she later in chapter 30 asked Leah for mandrakes that her son picked for her. Genesis 30:15 says, "But she said to her, 'Is it small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?'" If Leah knew all along that she was tricking Jacob into marrying her, would not the husband thief have been the other way around? After all, Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, and that was the deal he struck with her father. Once we understand that Leah and Rachel are also fooled, we realize that from Leah's vantage point, Jacob was supposed to be her husband. When Laban brought her to Jacob's tent, in her mind, it was her wedding night, and Jacob had just worked 7 years to marry her. As Leah experiences it, only in the morning when Jacob takes a good look at her, does he decide that he's married the wrong sister and goes to Laban to correct this. Thus, when Leah accuses Rachel of stealing her husband, she means it, and she continues to hope that he will change his mind and love her too. According to this reading of the story, Leah was just as shocked as Jacob was that fateful morning. All right, what do we have? We conclude from this that all 3 were deceived by Laban. Jacob thought he was marrying Rachel. Leah thought she was the intended bride because she was the oldest, and her father likely told her she was the intended. Rachel likely thought Leah was the bride for the same reasons. To complete his deception, Laban arranged an all-male drinking party to get Jacob drunk enough that in the darkened bridal chamber, detecting the switch would be difficult. That Jacob did not recognize Leah's voice as not Rachel's was a reasonable possibility because there had likely been only minimal contact between Jacob and the 2 women, and certainly no romantic courtship such as we would consider normal today. Thus, Jacob entered the tent, or whatever it was, and it was dark. He was likely tight. Neither of them spoke much. And even if they did, there was little history of conversations that Jacob would detect the switch. Since all 3 were deceived by Laban, when the trick was discovered the next morning, Jacob was surprised. But Leah was also surprised to discover her new husband wanted her sister instead. And Rachel was also surprised to discover she was about to get married. And that concludes our little backtrack into looking at this subject in a little more detail. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on this?
Only thought I had here when I read this, Wayne, is that it occurred to me. I think everything you've written is it's really good stuff to consider. The reasoning for this, not that it makes a huge difference in the scheme of the Bible, but if Jacob negotiated the deal to watch the sheep for 7 years. He's a sheep herder. Sheep herders were put out with the sheep to protect the sheep at night and watch over the sheep. So I looked at this and said, very likely he negotiated the deal and he didn't come back to see either one of the daughters for 7 years. When the 7 years were up, then he got back into the house because he done his shepherd duties for the sheep. So I looked at it and said, by he being a shepherd, very likely he slept out in the field. He wasn't had any contact with the family during this period. That all he did was look over the sheep. So that was my thought that wasn't included in this. Everything else I think is very, very plausible that it could have occurred. But I also thought about that. That's something to add.
I totally agree with you on that. The focus on the 7 years seems to suggest some maybe disjointed disconnection from the family that he was, working for this time period. Just about everything I suggested here is a lot of it is pure speculation based loosely on some hints of potential and understanding the culture and the process. But I think everything I saw there was plausible. I didn't come up with this, by the way. I found it on that website, thetorah.com. All right, let's close with a prayer. Thank you again, Abba, for this time that you've given us in your word and for the really marvelous and interesting things there that we see there. And thank you especially for your spirit moving on our hearts to make these things exciting to us, that we want to know more about you and about your plan and what you've done. We ask that your spirit help us as we go through this week, that we might be witnesses for you in Satan's world. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.